And I wanted to do several things today. One was to not end with just like the bad news of like what's going on currently in this kind of thinking, but by sharing some scriptures that have been helpful to me as I've kind of tried to negotiate this landscape in American culture. But first, let me go back to the 4th century. And I don't know much about the 4th century, but I do know this, that it's the century that, first of all, Constantine, when Constantine was emperor, he made Christianity legal, right? And that's early in the 4th century. By the end of the 4th century, it had become the official religion of the Roman Empire. And there's a lot of church historians, a lot of theologians these days who look at that moment and say, really good news, bad news for the church. The good news is that persecution is lowered significantly. So fewer people are dying because they are practicing Christians. The bad news is that when Christianity gets linked to the empire, things get complicated. And now do you, if you're not careful, slide into defending the empire, justifying the empire? Do you lose the prophetic message of the gospel when that happens? And so this, especially for some American theologians and church historians, this has been a moment to kind of reflect on as they think about whether or not that pattern has continued into American life, where the church has become too closely associated with empire, with the American empire this time, and therefore lost its kind of edge, lost its ability. The other thing that struck me as I was thinking about that moment when the church becomes associated with the Roman Empire is it really sends, then it begins a trajectory of theological reflection on authority, particularly the authority of, for lack of a better word, the state, and the authority of the church. So then the question then becomes, how do you divide this up? And it is really a question of authority. It's like, to what do we give the civil authority in our lives? To what do we owe that? And then to what do we owe the church? Okay. And this is, again, not something that is kind of foreign to Scripture, because when Jesus is asked, that question, it becomes, give me a coin. And he gives this wonderfully enigmatic answer, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto God what is God. Without following up to say, what is it exactly that belongs to Caesar, and what is it that belongs to God? Okay. And so various churches and various denominations have wrestled with this question. Like, how do we exist, the authority of the church, what is the authority of the church like compared to the authority of a civil government, the state, whether it's a monarchy, whether it's a democracy, whatever it is, how do we kind of parse that out? And then that's, to me, that's kind of like the big question that comes down to us in the American experience with the question of how do we think about the relationship between Christian faith and the American nation? Christian identity and our national identity. And the interesting thing too is that on the one hand, we don't have a state church. So it seems like, the church is free to be its own thing. But there is a sense in which the church is free to do its own thing because the state has allowed that freedom. And if you just think about it in economic terms, the tax laws make church property much more easily maintained than if those churches and religious organizations had to pay tax on that property. If we had to pay tax on the value of this property, we'd have a very different church life. We'd have a very different church life, wouldn't we? Okay, and so some have theorized that one of the issues with modern nation states is that they want to claim all authority for themselves, and then they grant authority to other entities. Even to the point that some have suggested that the state really recognizes two foci of authority: the state and the individual. The state and the individual. Everything else is either voluntary association or authority that is granted the possibility of having authority by the state. It's interesting, again, a long career in Christian higher education, and after a while it struck me as really interesting that at commencement we would process in led by the Christian flag and the flag of the United States. And in his final kind of conferring of degrees, the president of the college would say, by the power vested in me by the state of California and by the Board of Trustees, it's like acknowledging state authority, civil authority, or religious authority, because the Board of Trustees for Point Loma.
From the regents of the University of California,
well, because the college claimed a religious identity, it was given certain freedoms in hiring, for example, that would have been seen as discriminatory.
So, ergo, the church is far more discriminatory than the state?
Well, the church. I think not. I would just say this: that the Board of Trustees at a college like Point Loma reserves the right to hire Christian faculty, to discriminate in hiring based on Christian faith. That they're not going to hire Buddhist faculty, they're not going to hire Jewish faculty, they're not going to hire Muslim faculty. And that is a right granted to them by the state because of their identity. It's just that. I was just thinking that much. But the value of the degree would not be worth much if it were not also an accredited university by the state, by the regional accrediting board.
Accreditation doesn't come from the state. Does it come from an accreditation facility?
Yeah, that's why I'm using state in a general term, like the government. Like the government has to sanction those accrediting bodies, and those accrediting bodies accredit the colleges.
By extension.
Yeah, but the issue really is behind this is like, does the church have authority beyond that which is allowed by the state? Right. So that's a really interesting question to ask American Christians, because we so value the rights given to us, recognized, let's say, the rights recognized by the state, but sometimes can forget that we're also part of an international body, the small c Catholic Church, the Church Universal. Right. So in that sense, do we have more in common with Christians in another country than we do with some of our fellow citizens? Or do we have obligations? Right. Anyway.
Yeah, as part of that, I know I'm kind of new to the group, but church and state, Jen would share experiences where she's had opportunity to perform a wedding in the church that she was serving. And so she is a representative of the state when signing the marriage license.
Yeah.
But absent the state, maybe the higher authority in a particular case could be performing that same ceremony in the eyes of God.
Yeah, I think marriage is another really interesting example here because I've for almost the effect that it has initially for students, used to say that I have two marriages. one spouse, but two marriages. The one that is identified by the state and the one that is identified by the authority of the church in the eyes of God. And the state allows the dissolution of that marriage on very different terms than I feel the obligation of the church in the eyes of God, right? So I think that's a great example of it's like it's one marriage, but it exists in two very different realms if we take those realms seriously.
There's something interesting. In Isaiah 62, the phrase originates in the King James version of the Old Testament. The word believer comes from a Hebrew word that translates to married. And when you say that you have two marriages, you are married to your spouse, but you also are married to God.
Yeah. Right, there's a covenant relationship, right? Exactly, right, and that's another really interesting. Like, if this is a covenant relationship, it's a very different relationship than this kind of very kind of bound relationship. And yet, the state has great authority in our lives. If you think about, again, I think about state as like general sense, the government. Like, who has the authority to take my life, to legally take my life? State. The government apparatus. Who has the legal authority to imprison me? The state. So we grant great kind of authority to the state. And again, this is something, again, just to make the point that this is something that Christians have had to wrestle with down through the centuries. How do you recognize the authority of the state and the authority of the church while maintaining the integrity of the church along the way?
I think the founders' idea was no establishment of religion and guarantee the free exercise of religion. Yeah. So that means there's no particular religion that they're doing it. That's what the Supreme Court is struggling with right now, because they have a lot of claims from the free exercise clause that we should be able to do things that are in conflict that might appear to be established in religion.
Yeah. And this leads us to the most recent iteration of Christian nationalism. Again, since I've started thinking about this a long time ago, every once in a while it's like something pops up. It's like, oh, I recognize that. Some of you may remember when Pat Robertson, I think it was when he was running for president, said that a hurricane that struck was God's judgment on the nation for allowing gay marriage, I think it was. Yeah. Like, that's clearly judicial providentialism. Like, we have angered God, and this is the answer. Although it's not often spoken this way, I get a sense that some of the drive behind the move to make abortion illegal, once again, is rooted in a kind of historical providentialism. That the thinking is that if we allow abortion on demand to continue, we cannot be the people of God as a nation that we need to be in order to be used by God to bring salvation to the globe, to the world. So even though it's not spoken in those terms, it's like, how else do you explain really the intensity with which people not only want to make choices for their own lives, but for the lives of others? Right? Well, because if we're back to the Puritan understanding that if we allow that in our community, we are moving away from the historical providential relationship, the covenant relationship we have with God. And therefore we can no longer be used by God to achieve God's purposes. So even though it's not spoken in those terms, sometimes when I hear that rhetoric and the intensity of it, I think there's historical providentialism kind of undermining that.
I know a couple from Colombia that were doctors there, and they ordered them to do abortions, and that were against their belief in God.
Yeah.
So they moved from Colombia, and they live here now in California, and they had to renew their doctor's license and study and everything. They are doctors here now.
Yeah.
So they choose
And
to
then
leave the country because of their belief in God,
Yeah.
that they would not let the government order them to do abortions.
right. So that's the flip side of this, right? Then the people are like, do I have the right not to do something? And we get this throughout the American history. We have these moments when it doesn't happen often, but it does happen where people say, I do not want to participate in that because of my beliefs.
Timothy Snyder's written a number of books, on tyranny, on freedom, etc. And if you think about some of the core arguments, they are freedom is essentially the freedom not to, the freedom to be able to. And that's very fundamentally different than what she was just speaking to, because that is arguing against freedom to choose to and having your own sovereignty, as opposed to the sovereignty of the state.
Right.
That requirement that says, see, the issue is, I think, always coming back down to how much do we go about saying that while we believe this, we don't have the right to tell you that you have to believe that as well. And so that issue of freedom, I think, is the core argument.
Yeah. Yeah.
I always struggle with specifically the abortion issue in comparison to the death penalty issue.
Yeah.
And when you get to it's very obvious in the Puritan world when it's the scarlet letter A. We are willing to judge others when it suits us, and to take life, but we are also, somehow the state also believes that they know best, or that they have God's will when it comes to however you want to frame it, life, or that sovereignty.
Right.
And so it's always I see a conflict from the very beginning of judging the other, and when will we do that?
Right. Yeah, because I think you could apply historical providentialism to capital punishment and mass incarceration, saying we cannot continue taking the lives of criminals at the rate at which we do, and still be the people of God we were meant to be and fulfill God's purposes in history. Do you see how the rhetoric, it doesn't often get applied from the capital punishment issue, but it's certainly there. Saying if we continue, and I think you also hear it, it's kind of like in secularized terms, that especially around mass incarceration, like we cannot be the nation we're meant to be if we allow this. I think you could also say we cannot be the nation we were meant to be if we allow this continuing inequity between the 1% and the 99% in terms of income. So that the rhetoric is so malleable that it can go like, what do you articulate as the promise that you're trying to kind of reclaim? Okay, so the most recent expression of a Christian nationalism that I've encountered is called the Seven Mountain Mandate. And it is, I think, marked significantly by its aggressiveness. So earlier, kind of like, we're a Christian nation, like, well, what does that mean? We kind of let the state kind of define what it means to be a Christian nation. But this movement is an argument that Christians need to gain authority in 7 crucial aspects of culture. Religion, family, government, education, media, arts and entertainment, and business. And this, so this is not just, and again, it's not clear that the couple of men who first kind of articulated this may have been thinking about it primarily as a means of evangelism. Like, we will reach more people for Christ if we have Christians in positions of influence in all of these 7 areas. But it has recently morphed into Christians need to assert authority in these 7 areas in order to reclaim the country for God and become the kind of Christian nation that we were meant to be.
Is that reclaim the country for the God of whom?
Clearly, as evangelical Christians understand, and this is...
Well, does that mean everybody who's not a Seventh-day Adventist is bad? Is wrong?
Oh, I'm sure, yes.
Well, then that's a fundamental challenge for any quote-unquote Christian.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think so too, but...
I have a question, because you speak about education, and what I don't understand, like the children in our school, they took away the education about faith. I mean, the Christian education and prayer, they have also taken away prayer in schools, right?
Well,
Doesn't make sense.
sanctioned prayer in school.
Yeah.
Obviously, people can pray in school. This is more about, Inga, the argument about the 7 Mountain Mandate would bring back prayer in school as defined by the people who have authority, who feel like they have the authority to say this. Here's what I'm still wrestling with. The extent to which this is a Christian movement. It's like legitimately some Christians who think this would be a good way to spread the gospel. This would be a good way to spread the good news. This would be a good way to establish a more moral society. And the people who just say, here's a good way to get our hooks into a Christian population for an agenda that we want.
Well, isn't it an explicitly anti-non-Christian
Yeah.
philosophy? Because basically it's saying we need to take over
Right.
these other people.
And
so.
yeah, and not allow the kind of the drift that's occurred. I think the issue of family has been one that, because when they say Christians need to assert their influence on family structure, that's then being used by some people who are arguing that women should not have the right to vote. Right. That voting should be done by household. Assuming that in very patriarchal structures, the man of the house would make the decision for the household about how to vote. Okay, I mean, so that is like, wow. I'm not sure where you got that understanding of family, but you didn't get it from the New Testament I've been reading.
That's right.
Right, where Jesus elevates the status of women in every interchange with women. He elevates their status. So
That's
it's
probably worked years ago, but now, or decades ago, but now you've got a lot of single parents.
exactly. You've got people, but again, I think
they're
they.
supposed to do get an instant husband and say, okay, now we're a family.
I think but there's been a tendency in certain aspects of evangelical Christianity. There have been certain aspects that would argue that a young woman is under the authority of her father until she marries, and then moves under the authority of her husband. Okay, and that's just like, that's one of the things I looked at the 7 Mountain Mandate, and I thought, first of all, I'm not sure there's enough Christians, even as they define Christians, with the skills to move into leadership in these areas. Secondly, this is just so completely outlandish in terms of like just achieving this. But then you look at like some of the stuff that informs Project 2025, it's like, yeah, it's not, it's drawing on this. And so again, I'm not sure whether this expression of Christian nationalism is truly like out of concern about Christian faith flourishing, and how much is it about having a political agenda that you want as many Christians on board with as you can get.
with the current state of what seems to be white Christian nationalism,
Yeah.
specifically, and the Seven Mountain Mandate, Project 2025, etc. I mean, it's impossible to think that there's not a way that these organizations or trains of thoughts couldn't generate tremendous amounts of money.
Oh, they are generating tremendous amounts of money.
Right.
And then,
So how can they say, fix the disparity between the 1 and the 99
They don't know.
when they want to grift off you because of their project?
you know, the other interesting thing to me too is that this kind of this tradition of trying to figure out how to balance authority between the state and the church is something that churches and denominations have kind of labored with over the years. Southern California is the Christian landscape of Southern California is dominated by megachurches, where you typically have a charismatic male leader who may or may not have seminary education. And my guess is this conversation is way down his list of priorities, and maybe way down the list of things he's ever even thought about.
Yes.
And maybe his church is not a 501c3.
Right?
Maybe it generated profit.
Yeah. And so it's like the easiest thing to do is just to like embrace civil religion and, you know, put up a big, you know, kind of drape the church in a big American flag and kind of let people who feel tension there kind of figure it out on their own and just collapse the authority of these two entities into one, which is what so often happens. Brenda was reading me a piece this morning by, what's her name? Butler Bass. Really fascinating, where she pointed out that this is the fourth Sunday after Pentecost. In the liturgy for today is the passage where Jesus talks about father will be pitted against son, mother-in-law against daughter-in-law, and so forth. Like Father's Day. This is your lectionary scripture. I wonder how many preachers said, we're gonna, right? And because elsewhere around the nation, right, there's a lot of Father's Day sermons going on today.
Yeah.
Right, there's just like, so you either go civil religion, because that's a little messy when you get a lectionary scripture on Father's Day that talks about family tension. So it's that. So this is the latest iteration of this. And again, it's got some very powerful proponents. One is, I think her name is Paula White, who was in the White House as advisor to faith issues, that kind of stuff. Even though, and I don't know what she's doing with the fact that she's divorced, how that fits the whole family thing, but it's just really, really interesting. And again, there's a handful of very, very powerful and very wealthy preachers who are on board with this idea, that are bankrolling some campaigns across the country that certainly bear watching. But I do think it is one of the latest expressions of a tendency that goes back prior to the founding of the American nation.
Oh, yeah.
In terms of thinking about, do we exist as a people with a covenant with God?
Yeah.
And Stan, how that factors into kind of like individual freedom, the freedom of the individual and individual autonomy that comes to us out of the Enlightenment, is one of the points of real tension, I think, in the American experience.
And interestingly enough, I think there are a huge number of people who don't think about that, because that was in fact what our founders were reading. Mm-hmm. That was fundamentally what was embedded in making it be explicitly not a church-directed state, such as Massachusetts or Vermont or Delaware, etc. at the time.
Yeah.
And so that fundamental philosophy is not what is being made clear in school, much less quote unquote church sanctioned prayer.
Right.
And I think that philosophical base is what is clearly missing. I don't need to overdo that, but it seems like the Enlightenment is that which is the core element of not just the Declaration, but the Constitution.
What is interesting to me, though, is that those same Enlightenment thinkers were really uneasy about granting authority to the church in their own lives. It felt like, so the Baptist tradition is rooted in, there is no authority between me and God. It's like that God's Holy Spirit is what I answer to, not any kind of church structures.
Do you think that's fundamentally
No, I'm saying that,
relationship?
yeah, I think that starts with, then there is no authority higher than my personal relationship with Jesus. Right. And so some of those Enlightenment thinkers were like really uneasy with ceding any kind of authority to the church to tell them what they should or should not.
Well, the Catholic Church.
And then
it's an anti-Catholic.
yeah, and that's why the nation was anti-Catholic for much of its first 70 or 80 years.
We had people saying that John F. Kennedy shouldn't be
I
elected
remember
president
that.
because he was Catholic.
Right.
And take orders from the Pope.
Yeah, and he was asked this question directly by reporters. It's like, if you're elected president and the Pope tells you to do something, are you going to do it? It's like, I reflect back on that and knowing what we now know about John F. Kennedy, thinking,
No.
you took his Catholicism a lot more seriously than he did, I think, frankly. But Joe Biden was much more devoutly Catholic, and you watched him trying to negotiate that sense of authority. In some place, because it's like there's some people who then feel like, I don't feel comfortable claiming my own self as the ultimate authority. I need to be under somebody's authority. I want to make those choices thoughtfully and prayerfully, but I don't trust myself to make these decisions. I've certainly read enough American history to say that there's some people who felt like, I don't need any authority above me, who kind of went directions like, no, you do. You really need some authority above you. And so I take it very seriously that I live my life under the authority of Pastor Trudy and Pastor Hannah and Pastor Brittany. They are kind of acknowledged authority for me when I join this church. I'm like, okay, and then kind of like, I'm a little less confident. It's like, well, does that mean I'm under the authority of whoever comes next?
Yes.
Right?
No.
So it's like,
Well, yes, that's the question.
it should. That's the question, right? And so it's like kind of like a free church tradition. It's like, well, if I don't like this authority, I can go over here. It's like, oh my goodness, that's a danger. But eventually, if you don't embrace something along those lines, then finally just comes to like the trajectory of Protestantism is like you leave Catholicism as a matter of protest, and then you leave this group of Protestants as a matter of protest, and you leave this group of Protestants as a matter of protest, and pretty soon it's like it's just me and you, and I'm not sure about you. I'm sure I know I'm right, but I'm not sure about anybody else. And they're like, wow, philosophically, that's where the trajectory runs, and so it's back to that no authority over me except my own conscience and God's.
Yes.
And it's like, oh wow, that's a I don't know. To me, that's a recipe for some real.
So the Seven Mountains mandate discussion is it sounds like, as I'm listening to you, thinking about it, is essentially some group of people deciding what it is that is an appropriate way of establishing authority over all of you guys because you don't know as much as we are,
Yeah.
sort of thing. And so the issue then is how much authority do you want to let the state have or allow?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that the Seven Mountain folks would say you collapse these into one. And the authority of this, you don't have to worry about this tension any longer because you've collapsed the authority of the state. You've subsumed the authority of the state under the authority of a religious tradition as they define it.
There takes away the intent of the Constitution
Absolutely.
That we will not have a defined.
Yeah. This seems to be an anti-American move.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
I also would argue an anti-Christian move, because it is so narrowly defining who the real Christians. So the question we've been wrestling with over the last few weeks, like who's the real American, just becomes who's the real Christian, and that's who's going to kind of assume authority over all of this. Yikes. Right. I think this is, but it is the aggressiveness of the Seven Mountain Mandate that has some of us like really antennas up, kind of like this is Christian nationalism on steroids. This is Christian nationalism in a really different iteration.
There's been discussion that part of the advertisement for this whole group is white Christian church.
Yeah.
And something I think somebody mentioned about white Christian church. I've read enough things, other people's work on the black church in America, as opposed to that. Is there a black Christian nationalism?
There's black fundamentalism.
Well, I understand that, but we're talking about
No, I think that what's interesting is that the Seven Mountain Mandate kind of has some of its roots in Pentecostalism, where there's a lot of Hispanic aspects of Pentecostalism. So I don't know how there's nothing particularly white about the Seven Mountain Mandate. However, historically, the black church has been in such a different place with the American nation that it just plays out differently. It's in large part because America, you just couldn't make the argument historically for black Christians that America was a promised land. No, America's Egypt. I mean, the American South is Egypt, and the North is the promised land. But that becomes then, which is like a really optimistic take on the North, first of all. But in the civil rights movement, then that becomes morphed into Jim Crow is Egypt, and equality is the promised land. So I'm not sure, Stan, that it necessarily is different for the black church, but historically it has been different. In part because that rhetoric of that promised land rhetoric is so different in the black church. It's never America as a promised land.
There's part of that discussion, black as opposed to also color, not non-white. In the instance of some of my colleagues have commented substantially on Pentecostalism's growth in Mexico, but like Southern Baja California in particular, but also northern Mexico, as very differentiated from the Hispanic vote in, say, Arizona and Texas. And they aren't the same, but they have, if you look at them, sort of like saying, you see which ones of those are Methodists and Presbyterians or Pentecostal.
Yeah. I think that one of the things that political scientists are really watching the Hispanic vote as it's kind of coming up at the 2026 midterms, especially, because they were surprised at the percentage of the Hispanic vote that went to Trump. Given his immigration policies, it was a surprising how much.
How many, though, have been changing in the last 2 years?
That's what they've been watching, right? That's what they've been watching. Reverend Hannah tells me that there is a Korean Christian nationalism as well. That I don't know if it's making inroads in the United States, but it was certainly, she's aware of that kind of a collapsing of Korean national identity and Christian identity. So it's not, unfortunately, this may be something we're exporting that we don't really want to export as a nation.
Feature the globalist church.
Yeah. Can I share with you? Yeah, Jim.
I've often struggled with the idea that, I mean, we call it, we I guess identify it as white Christian nationalism, but even Christian nationalism, I would say it's more about authority. Yeah. It's really about, I want power.
Yes.
And I will exert that over the other, which goes very back to the beginning of it of we don't want to be under the church or another authority, and goes that individualism. But at some point, what is the authority? And if you continually define it for yourself, which is really what people are doing when they say, well, it's just about me and my God, because they don't necessarily want that authority. They don't want to read the whole context of the entire Bible. They want to cherry pick. And so if that is your authority and you say, I'm a biblical Christian, therefore I have authority, well, let's ask them about pigskins on Sunday. And do they, participate in football?
Yeah.
So there just becomes this issue of very much there's a desire to only have one authority, in which I go back to saying it's capitalism. It's the almighty dollar.
Yeah. Can we shift to just to try to leave on on somewhat of a positive note? I was asked. We had a pastor a while back who was talking about. He was preaching from Proverbs, and he talked about these are some of my favorite Proverbs. And he said, I would love to hear some of your favorite passages, some of your favorite Proverbs. And I remember thinking, I'm not sure I have favorite Proverbs. So I went back to Proverbs. And I landed on one that has become my favorite. When I shared it with him, it was like, that's not what I was thinking about at all, because he's more like, the Proverbs were more like individual wisdom. But listen to this, Proverbs 23, beginnings of Proverbs 23. When you sit down to dine with a ruler, consider carefully what is before you, and put a knife to your throat if you are a man of great appetite. Do not desire his delicacies, for it is deceptive food.
What?
Do not desire his delicacies, for it is deceptive food. I thought, that's my favorite proverb. Not that I plan to not that I'm going to have the occasion to sit down and dine with a ruler anytime soon. But I when I read that, I thought back to years ago reading Chuck Colson's book about being in the Nixon White House and saying that there was no one we enjoyed seeing coming more than an evangelical Christian group, because they were so hungry for power that we could just offer them a little bit and they would just be right on board.
Yeah.
Like, oh my goodness. And this, again, I stick biblical poetry, I tend to stay with the visual image for a while, because that's rough. And put a knife to your throat. It's like, it would be better just to slit your throat than to take the food offered by a deceptive power.
Yeah.
Because that is, if you want something that's going to corrupt you, there it is.
Yeah.
There it is. Proverbs 23, verses 1 through 3. I told my pastor, I was like, yeah, this is my favorite. He goes, I'm really concerned about you. And I said, yeah, I know. But the other, but then again, when people ask me my favorite promise, like, what is your favorite promise from Scripture? It's like, in this world you will have tribulations.
Well,
That's a given.
that's a given, and that's what the sermon was on.
Exactly,
today, about
exactly.
We are worn out.
Yep.
And you just do have to find a place to rest.
The other passages that have really helped me, one is early in Daniel, thinking about Daniel's life, because here they are taken into captivity, and King Nebuchadnezzar sends a word out. It's like, okay, I want these guys. We've taken this population into captivity. Pick the brightest guys. We want the brightest people we can find and educate them in the way of the Chaldeans, and help them find a place of service in Chaldea. Right? And Daniel and his friends go along with this, right? To a point. So the king appointed for them a daily ration of the king's choice food and from the wine. It's like, okay, like, teach them the ways of Chaldea, let them find a place of service. And Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah are okay with this. It's like, yeah, we can. This isn't our home, but we can find a place of service here. I do like the fact they make the first kind of, the first fundamental student move. They complain about the food. they complain about the food plan. like Danny said, I'll do that, but I'm not eating this. I gotta, but after they get past that, they accept the training and they find a place of service until it becomes, oh, and by the way, I want you to worship me. And then it becomes, we were okay with a place of service, but not with worshiping you.
Daniel refuses to eat.
Yeah.
He eats the lentils.
Yeah, that's what I'm joking about. He objects to the food plan because he wants to stay true to his tradition.
Yeah.
To his like, this is part of my identity. And we don't think about our identity, as Christians don't really think about their identity with food choices. Maybe we should, but we do. But it did give me this basic idea. It's like I can, as long as I can follow the authority of the church, I can find a place of service in the state. I'll draw the line when the state tells me you can't do that. It's like, well, guess what? I have to do that. And whatever issue that is, if it is personally, it's like, I will not perform abortions, or whether it is, I'm going to help this person who is in need because that person is my neighbor, and the commandment is to love my neighbor, and I'm not going to check and ask about their immigration status. It doesn't mean that I'm not telling the state that it doesn't have a right to have an immigration policy, but it is saying, if you're going to interfere with my call to love my neighbor, I'm going to answer to the higher authority in my life. And I see a great example of that in Daniel and his friends. Even more is Jeremiah 29, which contains one of the most quoted out of context passages in the entire Bible. Especially commencement season, there's so many graduation cards, Christian graduation cards. Says, you know the plans I have for you, to give you a promise and a future. After 40 years of exile, by the way, we skip that part. But here's Jeremiah's advice to the people taken into captivity. This is 29 verse 7. Seek the welfare. The Hebrew is shalom. Seek the shalom of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its shalom you will have shalom. Shalom is so hard to define. Welfare it's like the reign of God. It's like, as it is in heaven, may it be on earth, that we pray in the Lord's Prayer. That's what Jeremiah is writing here. It's a tricky. So I've embraced this metaphor of living as an exile. But I want to be really careful about it because there are millions of people in the world physically living in exile. And I have no experience of this. Okay. But if as a disciple of Jesus, my true home is the coming kingdom, if my citizenship is in heaven, then this is not my permanent home. And I don't want to go the direction of some of my forebears, like this world is not my home, I'm just a passing through kind of stuff, because it doesn't mean don't be engaged. It means be engaged in a particular way, knowing that the telos, the end, is assured by God. That battle is not mine. My battle is faithfulness in the moment. that I am called to. But this is not my home. Richard John Newhouse has written that means that every political victory is temporary, every political defeat is temporary. Because we know, it's another way of saying that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Right? That the kingdom is coming. The kingdom is coming. But if I can, and again, I don't think it means disengagement with the world in my society, but it means a certain kind of engagement that frees me up to not feel like I've got to convert the state into a Christian place or something, because it's not going to happen. I keep coming back to Nathaniel Hawthorne at the beginning of the Scarlet Letter when he writes that whatever utopian vision people have, they're going to do two things. They're going to build a cemetery and they're going to build a jail, right? It's not going to happen in this world. And then finally, John 13. And this is one that a Bible teacher I had, my Sunday school teacher for a long time, finally got me to give up the New International Version that I had been raised with and go to the New American Standard, because just what it does to this verse. Because here's what the NASB writes. Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, that he had come forth from God and was going to God. And apparently it's in the Greek. The word hands is in the Greek. The NIV says something like, knowing God had given him all authority. It's like, no, John. John uses the image of the hands significantly and purposefully here, because the next thing that Jesus does with these hands is wash the feet of the disciples. So my fundamental objection to the Seven Mountain Mandate is they want authority and power instead of service. Because whatever you think about in the current kind of cultural debate about privilege and what's the other word I want? Status, whatever. If you're a disciple of Jesus, he's already showed you what to do with any of that you have. And that is give it away. Give it away in love. Wash the disciples' feet. Knowing that God had given all things into his hands, that he had come from God and was going back to God. What does he do? Washes the feet of the disciples. That just is beautiful. That is just beautiful to me. And so what for me, it means that this is like trying to claim authority. It's like, no, you just serve. You just serve. That's what we're called on to do. So, I don't know. I don't know if that feels simplistic. It doesn't feel simplistic to me. I've studied the long history of this stuff, and I don't know any answer but just Christ-like service, and doing the best we can in the moment that we find ourselves.
One of the things in my work, my previous work, was about quote unquote architecture and design. Was that people used to always say, well, don't we have? And we had that discussion a few months ago about dominion over the earth and over what we do, and we're exercising our rights, etc. And part of what my various points were that no, we are in fact actually supposed to be serving and being good stewards. And then I'm going to cross that whole discussion in different ways. And I think of that as being adopting the idea of service as opposed to ownership or power. Yeah. And insofar as I said, those of you who understand these principles, you will have within your hearts the ability, not necessarily the power, but the ability to affect things that are collectively good as opposed to those things which are serving only one set of people's
Yeah.
requirements.
Yeah.
And so that was part of the message on that, in that direction.
Yeah. Well, and every once in a while, too, there'll be a court case where it's like, as a Christian, I have the right not to serve this. It's like who told you as a Christian, you have rights? You don't have rights as Christians. You have rights as a citizen. You don't have rights as a Christian. You've got obedience as a Christian. And that obedience is love your neighbor. It's like Jesus, I mean, he said, what's the greatest commandment? Like, love God, love your neighbor. Oh, it's not that complicated. But boy, do we make it complicated sometimes by seeking power.
It seems like the whiteness of the white nationalists is in direct response to feeling threatened by the rise of minorities.
By the demographics?
Yeah, and of course in 1860, that threatened them economically, et cetera,
Yeah.
and it's been a never-ending battle that hasn't really changed.
No, and again, it's to me the great American experiment is whether we can survive as a multiracial, multi-ethnic representative democracy. Because if you look now at our ruling,
Fed those flames, I think.
yeah, and if you look at the makeup of Congress, for example, the demographic makeup of Congress and the demographic makeup of the American people, it's like that's not in line. And so I think it is this question of like are those power structures going to shift, and if so, when? And what will it look like when they do?
Probably 20 years out, and it's probably because of this and all these young ones that have instinct everything. And there's a movement where the young ones are wanting to go back to keep it simple, less is more, and actually, I'll put this away for a hot minute, right?
Yeah.
Hearing this on NPR the other day.
Yeah. Although you get mixed. Even the young people who want to kind of put their phones away for a while will start getting antsy when they do, because it's an addiction that we have fed in big time.
I saw him coming by,
Yeah.
checking. But do you, could you do that announcement again about people, because some more people came in?
Yeah, there's a sign-up sheet over here. If you're interested in continuing into the fall, if you could let me know your contact information, that I can then talk to the pastors about what form this might take in late August, September, whenever we kind of get back to things. I hope that what it would be at that point would be to pick a common reading, so that I'm not spouting off every week. And I think John Fanistill's book, American Heresy, because of his connections to this congregation, might be a good place to start. Thank you, folks, for hanging in over the last 4 weeks.